not dim nor his natural force abated, levelled the score with just 15 minutes remaining. You never lose it. I mean, I'm not really sure how old he was at the time because there's doubt about it. With such a vast knowledge of football and a lifetime of experience and supervision, he was given a role as a consultant in the Egyptian government's Ministry of Social Affairs. Here he played an active role, cooperating with NGOs with vested interest in the sport. He was an advisor to the Egyptian FA and continued to influence the administration of the game in Egypt for the rest of his life. In 1956, he was appointed Director of Sports Affairs. But to many in his homeland, Hussein Hegazi was simply the father of Egyptian football. In his old age, he began to experience ill health and spent some time in hospital. In 1959, he featured on the front page of the Egyptian Mail, jostling alongside headlines of the principal statesmen of the day, President Nasser, Winston Churchill, Premier Khrushchev, all on the other parts of the page that I've cut out. There's the picture of Hussein Hegazi with his hoary head, and beneath the photo, the caption, Dulwich Hamlet as not forgotten Hegazi. On discovering their old wizard was poorly, the famous South London club sent their best wishes via the Cairo newspaper. Almost 50 years had passed since one of Dulwich Hamlet's finest players set foot on the Champion Hill turf, or mud, as it often was in those days, and he was still fondly remembered. Hegazi did reply to his old club, but the letter sadly has been lost. A further 2 years passed, and as it must to all men, death came to Hussein Hegazi. He died in October 1961. To get here tonight, you would have had to come into Edgar Cale Way. Well, the legendary Edgar Cale was not the first Hamlet great to have a street named after him. Following Hegazi's death, the road where he lived was renamed Hussein Hegazi Street in his honour. During Hegazi's playing days, and I'm nearly finished, the main two Egyptian club sides he played for, Al Ahly and Zamalek, totally dominated the domestic game, and they have done so ever since. Al Ahly were officially the top African club side of the 20th century, and Zamalek were second. Hegazi's influence on Egyptian football is incalculable. Through his back and forth transfers between the two Cairo clubs and the supporters switching clubs with him, he almost single-handedly caused the fierce rivalry and conflict that continues to this day. Hegazi is without doubt one of the key men that shaped Egyptian football. And just to finish, in 1922, when Hegazi was at the top of his powers, there was the amazing discovery at Luxor of Tutankhamun's tomb. The boy king's beautiful treasures and remains which had been hidden for centuries were finally unearthed for all to appreciate. Obviously, Tutankhamun is on an entirely different level to Hussein Hegazi, but I would like to draw a parallel. For many years, Hegazi's footprints have been concealed by the drifting sands of time, and we have to admit that Dulwich Hamlet has forgotten Hegazi. I trust, with the aid of our little book published by the Hamlet historian, that the marvellous riches of Hussein Hegazi, Dulwich Hamlet's Egyptian king, may be uncovered by a new generation to appreciate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that excellent talk, Jack. What we're going to do now is we're going to go between Dulwich Hamlet and non-Dulwich Hamlet speakers. And up next is Tim Godden, historian and illustrator, who will talk about his work in relation to the First World War.
I'm sure you know how to use these, Tim, but it's just a downward one. Good man.
And what we'll do is we'll have a question and answer session after all the presentations.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Alex, for having me along here, and thank you to Dulwich Hamlet as well for hosting this event. It's really nice of me to be here. I've travelled here from Devon, but my family are originally from Dulwich, Herne Hill, and Brixton. So it's kind of my ancestors' old stomping ground, but not my own. So it's really nice to be here. What I'm going to briefly look through tonight is a series of illustrations that I've been working on for about 18 months, 19 months now, which look at the stories of football and the First World War, where the two things cross over. Not necessarily always the famous stories, but where the two come together. But assuming that most of you won't know any of my work at all, I thought I'd give you a little background as to the kind of work that I did prior to thinking of this particular series. So, the predominant work that I've done prior to the football side of things is looking at the First World War, and that comes from my academic interests, which are or is the memorialisation of the First World War, in particular the cemeteries out in France and Belgium. And when I started the PhD, I realised I needed some way of decompressing from the quite intense research process. So I decided to return to illustration. I'd done graphic design as a job before I'd gone into academia, and so I went back to what I really wanted to do instead of being a graphic designer, which was being an illustrator. So this gave me the opportunity to kind of pick and choose the themes that I wanted to work with, and people seem to like them, and it's grown from there. But most of the work that I've done tends to be ink and wash, with the occasional digital rendered piece. But as with all the drawings you'll see here, they are all still hand-drawn ink work, which I then take into the computer to render. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with the process, but there's a fundamental difference between these two, for example, in that this is all hand-drawn, it's unique, there's only one of those, and in this type of one I can create a digital print run. And in fact there is no such thing as an original in that particular case, other than the black and white line work. So that's how as an illustrator, that's how I got going, and that has continued, as you'd imagine, through the centenary. It was I've been in relatively high demand, which has been nice, and culminating last year in this book that came out, which was the story of a young Welsh soldier based on his letters that he sent home to his girlfriend, a young 18-year-old boy who was conscripted and then is killed within weeks of both arriving in France and also of the end of the war. So this was kind of this is the illustrative background. Now, obviously, I don't spend my entire day thinking about the First World War. I have other interests, and one of those is football, and has been all my life. And so I thought to myself, why don't I illustrate football as well? And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the hashtag Soccer September or the other hashtag Football February on Twitter. And it's basically a forum through which illustrators and artists relating to football attempt to share a new piece every single day throughout the given month. And I decided to do this one February, and started originally with an awful lot of really the heroes of my footballing youth, all through the kind of the 90s and early 2000s. And I did a whole range of things, but I'm a collector of old tat, and one of the things I really love to collect are cigarette cards. So what I was trying to do was take the heroes of my footballing heritage and put them in a way that was more related to, say, my grandfather's footballing heritage. So, for example, one of the images up here, that's the entire Arsenal side that played the last game at Highbury, including the substitutes that came on and Arsene Wenger, but done in the style of a cigarette card series that I found from 1913. So you have things like Robert Pires with a handlebar moustache, and it was the kind of the blend of the two that I rather enjoyed. You can see on the end there, it's kind of continued from there as well, but the programme is from earlier this season for Norwich, where they do a fantastic image of an icon for every single programme that they do. And I was asked to illustrate one of their 1930s heroes, Bernard Robinson. But the football side of things then fundamentally had a connection with my own footballing heritage, but always with that eye to history. As I said, the idea is that those particular hashtags is that you post something every day. Well, that can be quite onerous to post something new every day unless you find a way of producing something in series, which is where the idea for the football came along, the footballers of the First World War. And the first chap that I did, thinking that, hang on a minute, if I come up with a template that I can effectively tell these stories through, I can much more readily create a new one every day, because all I have to do is draw the player and the background is effectively there and I can drop it in. As is often the way with these things, I didn't get anywhere near doing one a day because real work came along and got in the way. But it started the series. Billy Baker was number one in the series, and the reason I chose Billy Baker was nothing to do with the First World War at all. As it turned out, he was a very important part of the Plymouth Argyle team prior to the war. He served and was killed with the Footballers Battalion during the war as well. But the reason I chose him was that my then girlfriend, now fiance, her father played for Plymouth Argyle, and I thought, well, maybe I'll try and get in on his good books, and I'll put an Argyle player in as number one, and it worked out rather well. Choosing Plymouth Argyle as the first one. My future father-in-law also played for Argyle, so he is a season ticket holder now, so he regularly attends the games. By sheer chance, the people that do the programme covers for Plymouth Argyle saw this image and then asked me if I would do the programme cover for November the 11th, or November the 10th as their game was on. And so that was converted, using a similar style, obviously a new illustration, to create the Plymouth Argyle programme cover for the 10th of November. In fact, that was the first game I went to watch them play where they actually won. So that was something good about that. But interestingly for me was that Billy Baker had just been a kind of, I'd looked through the list of names and I'd selected him and gone from there. But that game where the programme was used as well, Billy Baker is such an important part of Argyle folklore that there was a huge banner unveiled as well for him before the game, and so it was a really prescient kind of tie-in with the front cover, the fact that both of these appeared, both of the illustrations of Jimmy McCormick and Billy Baker appeared within the programme as well, and it was kind of nice to get that recognition as well, that something you've chosen to do on a whim has a bit more broader impact as well. So the Argyle connection was nice, and from that, or prior to that as well, I'd also been contacted by the BBC about their Remembrance Day presentations that they were doing. There was a Friday night FA Cup game, and there was a Saturday football focus that they told the story of Sandy Turnbull, but they were struggling to find an angle on it, because those of you that have done archival research will know that it's very difficult to find very good moving picture archives of this era. There are very few teams that have anything of any great substance that are going to fill out an entire 10-minute television piece. So the few bits and pieces they had managed to find of the 1909 Cup final and a few other pieces, they interspliced and asked me if they could record me drawing Sandy and to kind of give a thread. The further I got into the drawing, the closer it was to the end of his life, unfortunately. So this was a really nice, again, validation for the choice of that Soccer September to go with trying to create this series. So they're the kind of the high level exposures of this series. So what I thought I'd do is take you through some of the stories that maybe aren't so well known. There's obviously the famous footballers. We've already heard about Walter Tull earlier today. Willie Angus was a Victoria Cross winner who, despite only playing a couple of games for the reserves for Celtic, is still obviously lauded within their fan base as one of their heroes. And as I said earlier, my father's side come from round here. My mother's side come from Edinburgh, and we're all Hearts fans. And there's still to this day a little bit of animosity to the fact that the entire Hearts team go off to war, and Celtic didn't, and Celtic won the league that year by the fact that Hearts had a much depleted side, owing to military training. So this is Celtic's this is the thing they hold up in response to that. Is, well, we've got a Victoria Cross winner, which is fairly hard on one hand to argue against. So these are the famous stories, and you know, part of the idea of this series is to tell all the stories, and part of that is a kind of crowdsourcing of all the stories. I'm not a football historian, I'm a football lover, and so the stories, whilst I can go off and research some of them, I can't research all of them. I rely on people coming to me and saying, oh, have you heard of this player for our club? He'd make a brilliant illustration. And in fact, I don't know if he appears in here actually, there's Nobby Nightingale I'm thinking about, the Charlton Museum chaps over there sent me about his story, because I don't know all of the club's First World War history, so it's a learning curve for me as well as kind of the research side of things. So the obvious story of the football in the First World War, aside from the very obvious one, which I'll get onto a bit later on, is the Footballers' Battalion. And there are obviously a whole range of footballers that signed up. And again, it's trying to capture the cross-section of players that served and the teams they came from, and trying to reflect as much of the variation within the battalion as possible. So Vivian Woodward was an officer, and the rest of them served through. James Williams of Millwall, there's a potential family connection which I'll never be able to fully corroborate, is that or a cousin of mine served in the Footballers' Battalion during the war, and had a very early recruitment number. As we understand it, that side of the family were all Millwall fans at the time. The only Millwall player to have signed up before my cousin's number was James Williams. So I will never be able to kind of fully say, but I suspect James Williams was possibly responsible, enough of a kind of shove along for my own relative to go off and sign up, and unfortunately both of them were killed, so it didn't end up particularly well for either of them. But again, I would say, not trying to be too maudlin with this, one of the things I've tried to do is to make this not entirely about those that died, because not everyone that went off to war died, and there are lots of footballing stories that didn't end at the armistice. So there is again a cross section throughout. Now, possibly the most famous story with the Footballers Battalion is that of Clapton Orient. As it stands, I don't actually have any of the players in the series, but I do have this other illustration. Oh, there we go, that's skipping past. This other illustration that I've done of two of them, Rich McFadden and William Jonas, both of whom were killed. Two of three of the players that all signed up for the Footballers Battalion and were killed over there. Eventually I will get round to putting them into the series as well, but it is really a case of there are so many stories, as you'd imagine, coming through, that it's finding the time between kind of actual work to bring them into fruition. So the other story of kind of mass recruitment is that of the 16th Royal Scots I alluded to earlier, with the Heart of Midlothian team entirely signing up. But it wasn't entirely Hearts populated. There were an awful lot of other Scottish sides that were represented in the 16th Battalion Royal Scots. And Jimmy Todd of Wraith Rovers was the first footballer fatality of the battalion. And perhaps suggesting the naivety of both the battalion and the families, when Jimmy was killed, the newspaper reported it as the first footballer killed with the battalion. And there was an uproar at this, as it suggested that others would be killed. Of course, unfortunately, they were right. Many, many more were killed, including Harry Watty and a number of other of the Hearts players, both for the 16th Royal Scots and in other units that they ended up serving in. So these are the kind of the two battalions that are represented. The rest of them tend to be individual stories, and again, they've all been professional footballers so far. So one of the things I really wanted to do was look at the players you would never in a million years have heard of. And this is where really the fan bases of these non-league sides and other teams have really been very important. So Bertie Powell played for Heybridge, just outside Malden in Essex. And he was the club treasurer. He was an important player for the side. He was a West Ham fan in